I'm Peter Reinhardt, and I'm an author, a chef, a baker. I've done a lot of things in the food world, but I have not always been a cook. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about my journey. When I started out, the first time I learned to cook was in a vegetarian restaurant in Boston back in 1971 when I had just finished. I had actually dropped out of college, and I was a film major. My goal was to be a writer and director of films, and it wasn't happening for me in college. I felt like I needed to get out. I knew that I could make films. I knew I could write. I knew I was creative, but I didn't know what I had to say. Felt like I wasn't ready to enter that competitive world of filmmaking. I needed to find out who I was. So I went on a journey of self-discovery. And I fell in with a group of folks who were opening a vegetarian restaurant in Boston called Route One Cafe. And our logo was a giant carrot. It was wonderful. We made carrot juice. We did all sorts of creative vegetarian cooking, and I learned how to cook there. There were a few people who knew how to cook already. All of us were self-taught. It was a sweet little cafe that also comprised kind of a co-op or communal group of workers who were supported by the restaurant. We weren't paying ourselves. We would it would cover the cost of our apartments or the buildings where we lived, and we developed a commune. And because everybody was there in a sense for the same reason on a kind of spiritual journey of self-discovery, we drew people like that to come and eat at our restaurant. So we met a lot of the spiritual leaders, the gurus who were passing through town, the Eastern Swamis and the Maharishis and people like that. We met people of all religions and faiths. We met Hasidic Jews. We met Buddhists. We met uh, there were guru teachers who were doing initiations on people. It was a gathering place that we called a spiritual nexus of gathering places, and it was a great place to kind of continue this journey and figure out who I was. Meanwhile, I'm learning how to cook and not realizing that I was kind of charting my career path, an avocational path of I was going to support myself by learning how to cook. As part of that journey, I went through a number of phases of spiritual searching, including turning east, yoga, meditation, Kundalini yoga. I did it all. I explored all those paths, and somehow, without anticipating it, without sort of expecting it to happen, I found myself, even as a young Jewish boy, going through these Eastern religions, which is kind of common back in the early 70s. If you get to any spiritual group, half the people in there would be Jewish people who decided to go out on a search like that. Somehow I ended up connecting with a Christian group, and unexpectedly, it spoke to my soul. And it connected with me in a deeper way, and it answered a lot of my questions. I don't want to go into too much detail about why and how, except to say that it wasn't like any other Christian group. It was not evangelical. Escape the ordinary and ignite your culinary journey with Forno Bravo, the ultimate outdoor cooking companion. And I became Brother Peter and hooked up with a lot of other seekers that were, whether they were Jewish, Protestant, Catholic, atheists. They all found themselves there, and we had a number of community houses spread across the country. And this was from 1974. For the next 10 years or so, I got deeper into studying and going to seminaries. And because I knew how to cook, I always ended up in the kitchen somehow, and I loved cooking, and it was a lot easier for me than going and working an outside job. We supported ourselves by working at jobs, outside jobs, and then holding all things in common. So we lived communally, and some of us had to work inside. We had inside jobs because we had to also hold our households, and we called them brother houses and sister houses. But we were men and women living together. Some were married, some were raising families. We were all living under vows of poverty and humility, service, and one vow that was a tough one was called purity, and it was basically, we were trying to live chastely. If you were not married, you were not having sexual relationships with people. It was, it was an experimental group, very unique. But there were other groups like that in the 60s and 70s. But this one was, in my mind, the one that spoke to me, and I became fully involved. And I got married. I found my wife. She was Sister Susan. We opened a restaurant, and that restaurant was a ministry for us in which we could provide jobs for people and services in the town where we lived in Northern California at that time. And I continued to develop my cooking skills, including bread making. because while I was at the vegetarian restaurant, the Route One, we used whole grain sourdough breads that we didn't make ourselves, but I was fascinated back then by the process, always wanted to know how to do it. And now that we had a restaurant, I taught myself how to make bread. And it was like going down a rabbit hole. The deeper I got into bread making, the deeper I wanted to know how to do it, why it worked. And like a lot of people who became bread makers, and now in the mid 80s, I just went deeper into the why of how bread making works. And around 1990 or so we're covering a lot of years now, we had a restaurant, a ministry. I started writing books. I went back to my earlier goals of being a writer, and I wrote a book about bread as a metaphor. It was called Brother Juniper's Bread Book, Slow Rise as Method and Metaphor. And Brother Juniper's was the name of our bakery, Brother Juniper's Bakery and Cafe in Forestville, California. So I wrote a book about bread making based on my experiences of creating original breads for our cafe. That the best way to compare it, the analogy would be that the breads went viral. People, really loved the breads, and it grew into a business of its own. And we eventually closed our restaurant. My wife and I had this restaurant, but the breads were kind of taking on a life of their own. And so I went all in on the breads, and I built up the bakery for another couple of years, to the point where I had written a book. I wrote a second book about our restaurant time, and all of it was sort of food as metaphor for the journey of self-discovery. That's really my theme. And so everything I write about, even though literally I write about bread as, bread is bread, I'm always also working on the levels of metaphor, of philosophy, of theology, and the deepest level we call mystical theology. And so we took the bakery as far as we could. I'm not a businessman. I didn't really have a passion or a sense of calling for running a business. I wanted to teach and write. And so we sold the bakery to some kindred spirits who saw the bakery as something they could continue to develop and grow. And I went full-time into teaching. And by then I had written enough books and had enough credibility to get a job as a bread making teacher for the California Culinary Academy in San Francisco. And I taught there for 5 years. And throughout that time, the Bread Bakers Guild of America came into existence. We started studying with some great European bread masters. The American bakers were across the country were kind of simultaneously coming to the same sort of passion for bread. And the whole concept of bread in America took a huge leap in the early 1990s. And since then, we have developed a great artisan bread community, which I can trace to the Bread Bakers Guild of America being sort of the launching pad for that, for bringing together and being a repository for the knowledge of how to make great bread. So my writing theme was always about bread and food as metaphor. And now I was learning the science, and I was teaching it full time. So I had to be able to explain the functionality of ingredients and the why. I had to learn baking science, things that I never studied before, but I had to because I had to teach them. And so, but I fell in love with the teaching aspect of it. And I've been teaching now for over 30 years. I started teaching in 1994. I also would teach classes around the country at small cooking schools. And now here it is 2024. So we're talking about a 30-year journey of teaching, in which that became my craft. Teaching is now my craft instead of filmmaking, but my theme and the sort of the lens through which I teach is food as metaphor, but also bread in specific, food as a symbol of transformation. That's my theme. And it's taking me to the present moment. And along the way, when I ran out of things to say about bread, I realized that the other thing I was passionate about was pizza. And so I started writing books about pizza. And my first pizza book was in 1994. 1994, I wrote a book called American Pie, My Search for the Perfect Pizza. So pizza then became the metaphor that was telling a deeper story. It's not just pizza as pizza, which it has to be about that literally, but also at the deeper levels, what does pizza signify? And as good fortune would have it, the American pizza community and pizza movement was growing and going into an artisan direction. And the whole pizza community has exploded with incredible creativity. And we're seeing a golden era now of pizza as we've never seen it before. a lot of it drawing upon the knowledge and wisdom accrued by the artisan bread community, sharing that knowledge. There's an overlap between those two worlds. And as somebody who's been writing about these things and tracking them, I get to speak at conferences and things like that and talk about it and bring together these ideas that I've been playing with. I'm not a pizza operator, but I know how to make great pizza. I know what makes great pizza. And people who operate pizzerias want to know how can they make their pizza better. And that's what I help them with. So I wrote a couple of more books, one of which is called Perfect Pan Pizza. This is one where, as the pan pizza movement kind of caught fire a few years ago, Detroit-style pizza became big. The other types of pan pizzas like Sicilian-style, focaccia, grandma pizzas, all those, any pizza baked in a pan, now Roman-style pizza is getting big. That was starting to happen. So I wrote a book about that. And more recently, I wrote a book called Pizza Quest because along the way, I started a website with some friends of mine called Pizza Quest, in which we continued this never-ending search for the perfect pizza by going out and videotaping and filming around everywhere we could go to find people who were on fire with pizza, to find out what it was that drove them and what were the things that they knew that other people that love pizza also wanted to know. And then after the pandemic came along, we transitioned that into a series of podcasts. So currently I've got well over 100, maybe 200 podcasts up on my website, pizzaquest.com. And we also have an audio version of Pizza Quest through the Heritage Radio Network, where I get to interview some of the greatest, not only pizza makers, but artisans of all types. We call Pizza Quest a journey of self-discovery through pizza, but also a celebration of artisanship wherever we find it. So we talk to people who are growing great tomatoes. We talk to cheesemakers, to beer makers. Beer is liquid bread. All these things, anything that has to do with fermentation, I'm on board with that. And so this has become the beginning of my Act 3 period, where we're going to explore as deeply as we can through the metaphor of pizza, the purpose of life, or what gives life its meaning and purpose. And that's really what Pizza Quest is all about. That's always been my purpose and mission. Food has just been the horse I rode in on. And that is the story of, my journey. And so as I kind of bring this to an end, and it's still ongoing, but I'm moving, away from teaching full time and now doing more teaching through media like this, through doing podcasts and talking to you directly. I'll leave you with what I call the pizza maker's blessing. I have a bread baker's blessing, which is may your crust be crisp and your bread always rise. And I call the pizza maker's blessing, may your pizzas all be perfect. I'm Peter Reinhardt, and this has been my journey.